I'm very pleased to recognize our trustees here this evening. Judy Rowan, our Vice Chairman of Development. Thank you, Judy. Vicki Guys, our Vice Chairman of Governance and Finance. We have Pam Jedham, Caroline Seeke, John Ring, Ed Rowan, and I'm very happy to recognize one of our newest volunteers, Pam Connery, who's doing a wonderful, thank you Pam, who's helping us with our books. We really appreciate that. And I'd like to thank everyone not only for coming out tonight with all the snow and the weather, but for those of you that came to trivia night. Yes. And I'd like to thank, this is a brainchild of Vicki and Judy and a couple of other people that came over to Vicki's house. And Barbara Rumkunis, you were outstanding. Yeah. So I'd like to recognize, of course, Barbara as our wonderful curator and an outstanding job that you did. And now I would like to turn the mic over and recognize our program manager, Laura Martin.
Margo Burns is our speaker tonight. Margo is the 10th generation great-granddaughter of Rebecca Nurse, who was hanged in Salem in 1692.
Cousins here.
She was hanged on the charge of witchcraft. Margo, though, is the project manager and an associate editor of Records of the Salem Witch Hunt, published in 2009 by Cambridge University Press. This work is the definitive collection of transcriptions of the legal records of the episode. And here she is.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Anne. It's great to be here in Exeter, and wow, I think we've got a standing room only crowd. This is great. Does everybody have a handout? Good, okay. I am Margo Burns, and I've been doing Salem stuff for, at this point, about 20-25 years. The book that I showed you, it took us 10 years, there were 12 of us, and it took us 10 years to go through all of the primary sources, the handwritten things, decode them, make sure that we had it all accurate. We dated them, we identified handwriting. It took a long time, and the day that book came out, which is the size of a ream of paper, I went, kind of small. And what this particular talk is I want to tell you what those primary sources can tell us about the Salem witchcraft trials. I really like helping people understand how we know what we know. And I'm going to take you on a little ride on what it took to go from saying nasty things about your neighbor, oh, that old witch, and gossiping about her, to actually hanging her. Now, did anybody watch the Smithsonian Channel last night and see there was a thing on Salem last night? Oh, good. I wasn't in it. And there's a reason why I wasn't in it, because I don't agree with a lot of the things that were said. So if you go and watch it, I think it's on again tomorrow sometime. It's very good. Some of my colleagues went and figured out how to show how we know where the people were hanged. But I get you fresh. You get to watch them later. All right, I do like this material a lot, and I am quite happy to take quick questions during the talk, and then at the end I'll stick around as long as you want, or as long as they'll keep the lights on. Fair enough? Good. Okay, this is the title of the talk, as the Humanities Council wanted me to do it. I did not write this. Capital Crime, Witchcraft, the primary sources tell us. This is my title. But this is really what it takes, because we sometimes think about witchcraft trials and people with pitchforks and running after people with the torches and then stringing them up, and that's not really how it happened. It really was a complete legal process. And one of the things about our colonial forefathers and mothers is they left lots of pieces of paper. And that's how we know what happened. Whenever I talk about this, I like to situate people in place and time so you know where we're talking about and when. So this is a map, it's a Belgian map from 1665. And you can tell here at the bottom, let me see, oh my little pointer's gonna get absorbed. Down here's Long Island, you can see Cape Cod, that great big river up there, that's the Merrimack. You can see the Connecticut River. Actually, we're only gonna talk about one part of it, this section. And this one, you can see Boston down here, and Cape Ann, the Merrimack River, Great Bay. If we compare it to, okay, there we go, that's today. And you can actually you can make it out. Here we got Boston, and the islands, and see, here we go, here's Boston, and there's Salem. I got shifted a little, I think. But it's pretty accurate. Once you start looking at the old maps, they really do make sense. I think because most of the travel in those days was on the coast, the maps are very, very accurate about what the coastline was and where the rivers were, where the inlets were, where all those things were, because that's how you got around. And clearly, with 495 and 93 and things like that, we don't care. But they really made a big effort, and you see right here in the river, the islands themselves are important. You're not going to see those in some of the ones we have today. So let's look at it today. We have all these little teeny towns now. And let's see, where is Exeter up here? Up here? Yep. Yeah, okay, well, in earlier days, they were a lot larger. Yeah, it's really interesting for me because when I do this research in the 17th century, I hear the name of a town and I go, oh, but that takes up so many more towns than I'm doing. One of the things I'm working on now has to do with the chief magistrate in the witchcraft trials, and I'm at about 1680 with him. And you guys all know your history. What happened in 1680 with New Hampshire? Yeah, that's when we became the province of New Hampshire, right? And that was because William Stoughton, the chief magistrate, later on screwed it up. He'd gone to talk to the king about keeping Exeter, Dover, Portsmouth, and Hampton in Massachusetts. And even though all the towns said they wanted to stay, the king said no. So this is why we're in New Hampshire, is that chief magistrate didn't quite make it happen. In all these big towns, that's since been divided up, there's one little place here that you see in red, where you could see, if you could see this, is called Salem Village. It's just part of the town of Salem. You'll hear it called Danvers these days because they, well, when things get divvied up and they could get away from that Salem name, they did. At that point, what happened was that there were a few children, 2 children, the daughter and niece of the minister in the town, who suddenly were having all sorts of strange things. Fits, they'd be falling down, running around, doing things that just weren't right. And the minister did what most of us do, is call the doctor. The doctor said, I can't find anything wrong with them. Well, maybe they're bewitched. Oh, great. So what do you do when you hear that maybe your kids are bewitched? You call in other ministers. And with the other ministers and everybody else, you pray and you fast. I mean, they didn't run right to who's bewitching them. They had a set number of things they were going to do. But then one of the neighbors of the minister decided to use a little white witchcraft to try to figure out who the witch was. And this involved taking some of the girl's urine, gross, and mixing it with some rye meal and baking it and having the dog eat it. Okay, now. Doesn't that sound gross? Yeah. Well, the whole idea was, and I'll talk about this a little more, is that when somebody bewitched somebody else, and Diane is my friend, so I feel I can bewitch her. Right? Okay, I can bewitch her. The idea was that the witch would have these invisible malevolent particles, effluvia, that would come from her eyes and go into the person and afflict them. That way she had power over their entire body, or an animal or something like that. So all this malignant effluvia would go in, and but you could find it in the hair, you could find it in the urine. In animals, you could cut off the ear of a horse or a pig that's supposedly afflicted. If you did damage to those things, like having a dog bite a cake made with the urine, or something like that, sometimes you hear about witch bottles, hairs being stopped up in bottom. If you could hurt those particles, you could hurt the witch. Yeah, okay. Just for general reference, I believe in invisible things. I bet you do too. I've never seen a virus, but I was sick all of February. I believe in viruses. I also believe in planets. I'm still out on whether it's a planet or not, but there are things, invisible world things that we just sort of take for granted as part of our understanding of the world. And this was part of how they understood witchcraft, that a witch could do these things and control and hurt other people. So when this woman decided to do this, that just sort of let loose a fury. And the minister actually said, by going to the devil to find the devil, she had actually let the devil into their town. And that's basically where most people know this story, that these two little girls were afflicted. They started accusing other people. Their Indian slave, Tituba, Sarah Good, who was an impoverished young mother, Sarah Osborne, who didn't go to church all the time, because you were supposed to. She didn't always go, and she married the handyman. And so she wasn't really a good member of the community. So it was really easy to accuse the usual suspects. And you'd think it would end there, but it didn't. The other thing, too, is that if you know this basic story, you already have all the elements. You have the kids who are afflicted, the dad who's also the minister, you have the people who are accused, and Tituba, well, she's marked by race and status. She's an Indian slave. You have the other people, that would be Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, hey, the Sarahs. And then you also have the judge that comes in and examines everybody. That's pretty much the story. But the thing is that it didn't just start there. It also was starting in Chelmsford and in Ipswich, right around the same time. As a matter of fact, right before the stuff happened in Salem Village, there was a woman in Chelmsford in October of 1691 who was already in jail for witchcraft. We don't know too much about her case, except she was in jail the whole time that everybody in Salem was in jail. And also over in Ipswich in February, there's a woman named Rachel Clinton, who had nothing to do with these little girls. And she was being accused by somebody else entirely. So when you want to tell the story of a whole bunch of people, there are 153 people who were accused formally. It's really hard to tell that story cleanly, because there are too many threads to follow. And that's one reason why it's really kind of nice with the little household in Salem Village. It's a good story, but it's much messier than that. And the reason I'm going to do it the way I do it is because I want to show you what it took. I will not talk about any individual story from beginning to end, but I hope I'll find some ancestors, some people in here. Anybody else other than Rebecca Nurse? Who's yours?
Margaret Stevenson Scott.
Ooh, you don't get too many of those. She's awesome. And she was one of the people who was hanged, and people go, who? There are only about 9 documents in her case.
Yeah,
so.
And she was 78 years old, and the reason that she was hung was because her son had kicked her off the property. And so she was begging in town, and people just got sick and tired of her begging. And that was her only crime.
Oh, begging was not a good thing. Well, actually, it wasn't so much the begging, is that people didn't want to give to beggars, and they started feeling guilty. Charity denied could make the person who needed stuff guilty. Who knows? Anybody else got?
Rebecca Ames.
Ah, Rebecca Ames. Oh,
She didn't hang.
no, but she confessed and pled guilty.
Yes.
But she was going to be hanged.
Yes.
You got a Rebecca Nurse?
Well, she was an aunt, but Susanna Martin was a grandma.
Susanna North Martin of Amesbury.
To Mary Bradbury, and then the ring buttons from Kittery.
The who?
Ring brackets from Kittery.
They weren't part of the Salem stuff. No, okay. They were, okay. Mary Bradbury is kind of interesting because she was convicted and escaped and never hanged and survived. Anybody else? I see another hand over here. Yeah, oh boy, we got lots of people.
I'm a direct descendant of Goody Osborne.
Ah, okay, so I just, now wait a minute, this is Sarah Osborne?
She was married to Robert Prince.
Yep.
When he passed away, she married the overseer of the farm.
The handyman, yeah. Not a good thing, don't marry down, yeah. So, I saw one other hand up there.
I was raising.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Also Susanna Martin.
Susanna Martin, yeah, a lot of people, if it isn't Rebecca Nurse, it's usually Susanna North Martin that I hear the most of. She must have been pretty prolific. Anybody else? Yeah? Oh, wow.
Mary Rowe from Gloucester.
Oh, one of the last 3. Yeah.
Frances Judkins, I think, from Newbury.
Jenkins?
Judkins.
Judkins, that's not a name that's ringing in the Salem trials?
I don't know if it was in Salem or not.
Ah, okay. You never know. I know all the names on the top of my head, and that one's not coming to me. But, another one? No,
Raising for
You're raising for him, okay. Yeah, there were 3 at the very end from Gloucester that got accused and sort of nothing ever happened to them. But if you watch Who Do You Think You Are, the very first season, they had Sarah Jessica Parker, and in the ads they say, and she is descended from one of the last 3 people to be accused. I said, okay, what you got? That's choice of 3, yeah, from Gloucester. So I have one other hand somewhere.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, is the treatment of the witches a holdover from England?
I can get into a little bit of that, but they were English citizens, and yes, they followed English law. Yeah, so it's not like they were burning them. Okay, well that's a good bunch of descendants. So in this, I will be touching on different people, so you'll maybe hear something about your ancestor, or maybe not. But I want you to know what the process was. So we already have a whole lot of accusations going on in February, March 1692, but we also, in January of 1692, up in York, there was an attack on York by some of the indigenous people who were kind of fed up with the way the English were stealing their land and things like that. And when they attacked, it was Candlemas, and so that's January 24th, 25th. And it depends on which way you're telling it. It's either the attack on York or it's the Candlemas massacre. You know, whoever gets to tell the story gets to name it. 100 of the English settlers were killed, and another 80 were taken prisoner and walked to Quebec City. That does not sound like fun in the middle of winter. But we're having a lot of problems on the frontier. And so there were a lot of people who were experiencing massacres, death, and they were refugees coming down from the frontier into this area of Salem and the rest of those places. So there was already a lot of anxiety. Before we're through, we have accusations in all these towns. All the way up to Wells, Maine, down into Boston, all over the place. So it wasn't really constrained to that little Salem village stuff. That's the story you may know. You may have heard that. You see the Crucible. It's all about what happened in Salem Village, but it expanded everywhere. You see a couple of places like Hampton. Nothing in Hampton. That's because they did all their stuff in 1680. And I'll talk a little bit about them. Yeah. And then Bradford and Wenham. I guess they were just too small. They didn't have a local witch. But it really went everywhere, and everybody knew what was going on, and it was big news. For timing, and I've got a little handout here. The handout has that map on it, but it also has this timeline. I made this because I knew at some point I'd give a talk and the technology would fail. And I wanted to make sure people could see some of these things. And sure enough, one time it did. So this is the timeline of the prosecutions. And you see Martha Sparks on the far left. That was the one in Chelmsford. Now there were 2 courts that heard the cases. The first one that we know most of is the Court of Oyer and Terminer in 1692. And you see the pink area on this and then the red area. The pink area is when people were starting to be accused, but they didn't have a court to hear the cases. So they kept piling up and piling up. Now I said 153 people were formally accused. 70 of them were in that pink area before they actually had a court. So they had 70 people in custody waiting for the court to open up. When we get into the red area, that was when they had the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which basically means to hear and decide. And there were 4 sittings of that court. It looks like they were going to have another one. They had a big discussion as to whether they were going to, and then decided not to. It was getting cold. So during that time of the court, and it wasn't the regular seating of how they had their superior courts of judicature and things. When the governor arrived at the end of May, he said, whoa, what do you mean there are all these people in jail? So he was able to set up a court that could hear those cases. And you needed a very specific kind of court that can hear capital cases. So he set it up pretty quickly, and then they went. They convicted more than 19, but they executed 19 people. They also executed somebody by pressing him to death. People have heard that one, yeah. Giles Corey, yeah. Because there were some interesting things in the proceedings. He was indicted, and he went to plead, and he said not guilty. And then there was this little formulaic thing that they had, where you had to actually agree to be put on trial before God and the country being the jury. And he said, no. And they went, "What, you have to agree." No, he was like 80. He wasn't going to go along with this. And they didn't really know quite what to do because they couldn't proceed because he was messing up the works. So they pulled out this kind of archaic punishment, which is called peine forte et dure. They put him down, they put a board on top of him and piled stones until he couldn't breathe anymore and died. So grisly, grisly, grisly. And sometimes he isn't counted in the number of people who are executed, but really, that was an execution. Now, you'll hear something, it's really interesting to me when people tell me the story, because I say I'm an expert on this and then they tell me the story. And one of the weird things is they say, and then after the summer, and they executed people in September, they realized they'd made a mistake and everybody went home. And no, it was cold. And they said, well, we're going to wait for the next official starting of the court, which is the Superior Court of Judicature, which started in January. So all the cases that they had still in the pipeline, the people who were arrested and were in jail, the people who had been indicted but hadn't been tried, all these different things, they just carried over to January. And they convicted 3 more people in January. And those people and the people who hadn't been hanged before, if a woman had been pregnant, they wouldn't hang her right then, they'd wait until she had the baby. They were going to hang more people in January, 8 more people. And that's when the governor stepped in and said, I'm going to reprieve them. And the chief magistrate got mad and stormed off the bench. But all the rest of the cases that they heard, and every one of those ticks is a seating of the court, nobody else was found guilty. Most people weren't even indicted. And if nobody showed up against you, they would say, oh, well, cleared by proclamation. If nobody's going to show up to accuse you, no harm, no foul, kind of. So that's really the timeline we're talking about. Also, this timeline, I love timelines, if you can't tell. The number of accusations that came in. And you can see this little tick here, it's yellow. The yellow is Salem Village. Those are the 3 people, Tituba, Sarah Osborne, and Sarah Good. And then there's a little bit of thing, there's a single one, and that's Martha Corey, Giles Corey's wife. Then 2 more, Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter, Dorothy, and Rebecca Nurse. So you got a whole bunch of things going on right there. And then, notice it just swells. I've color-coded them this way with Salem Village, so you can see just where the Salem Village ones are. Notice there aren't any in the second half of the year. And the green is just Salem Town. All the black part is other towns, because you saw how many other things there were. And see this one that spikes way up there? What's that, 12 people? And that's right at the end of May. They decided to have the courts, and it was like they sent out word, did we miss anybody? And there were people from all over the place. They said, oh yeah, and Elizabeth Howe. Yeah, I've always wondered about her. So they just rounded up everybody they could because, hey, they're going to prosecute witches, let's get them all. And then in the beginning of June, they had the first seating. They indicted 3 people, executed 1, they tried and executed Bridget Bishop. And so there you have a few more people coming in, but then there's a gap. And that's because clearly the court was doing its job. It was trying people. But somewhere at the beginning of July, there were a few more. And the middle of July, notice this one little tick that's in red, that's Andover. They managed to coerce this elderly grandmother in Andover to confess in spades. Over several days, 5 days, they interrogated her. And she was saying all sorts of things. She was, I was on a pole flying and I started falling off. And Susanna Martin grabbed me and so I wouldn't fall. She just came up with all these wild things. And then the few ticks you see after that, that's her daughter and granddaughter. And notice how much is in red in there. About 1/3 of the people who were accused were from Andover. And just about every single one of them confessed. Yeah, we have a few people confessed here, but just about everybody from Andover confessed. And you see a few more things from other towns. Oh, there's another couple from Salem. And then back there in November, that's where we get our Gloucester people. But by then, they aren't really pursuing new people on this. But there's 2 phases of what was going on. When you're dealing with 153 people, you've got to have some kind of way to sort of step back and see them all. And I find these things really helpful to me. Let's get to some of the documents. This is a warrant for the apprehension of Rebecca Nurse. Because if you went to the local magistrates and said, I think she's harming me. If somebody had stolen your cow, if somebody had cut down a tree on your property, any kind of local thing, you went to the justice of the peace because their job was to make peace between people. And so these people in this case wanted to say that they thought that Rebecca Nurse had bewitched their daughters. So they went to the local magistrates, in that case John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin. Hathorne is the ancestor of Nathaniel Hawthorne. And Jonathan Corwin, you can actually go to his house. It's called the Witch House. I've heard it called the Corwin House, but it's called the Witch House right in downtown Salem. It's a fabulous old house. If you've never been in one, it's one of the few first period houses you can actually go into. And it's fabulous. So these guys listen to the complaint and then decide whether they think they need to bring anybody in. And they said, sure, go arrest Rebecca Nurse. And this down thing at the bottom, the marshal said, okay, I went out and got her and delivered her just like you said. So they brought her in. The next thing they do, and in this case, these early ones were done in Salem Village, right in their little teeny village. And this is one of 4 pages of the account of the interrogation of Martha Corey. Remember, she was the 4th person who was accused. There are 4 pages like this. It's in this cramped little handwriting. That's because the person who was taking it down was the minister. And I don't know about you, but I don't know shorthand. But people who are very religious, especially young ministers, learned how to write in shorthand. They would go and listen to ministers give sermons, and they would write them down. And he had that skill, so they asked him, hey, could you take notes? And he made it. I mean, it's like drama. This is why Arthur Miller poached from it. I hear some of those things in Arthur Miller, I go, no, that's from Bridget Bishop's thing. Oh, no, that's from Martha Corey's. It's great stuff. So, it just, Hathorne, tell me now why you hurt these persons. And what do you say? I do not. What do you do when somebody accuses you of something you're not doing? So, well, he's not going to let it go. I mean, he's asking, he's assumed that she actually did it. I said, well, who doth? And the assumption is that somebody is actually doing that affliction. These are leading questions. So what do you do at that point? And she says, pray, give me leave to go to prayer. Because she's going to keep saying, I'm a gospel woman, this is not me at all. But Hathorne has gone into that and said, we do not send for you to go to prayer, but tell me, why do you hurt these? And what can you say in that case? So she said, I'm an innocent person. I never had to do with witchcraft since I was born. She knows where this is going. But it goes on for 4 pages. And also, the way he wrote it, there are places where he describes what's going on. There's a whole bunch of sound. At one point, somebody throws her shoe at Martha Corey and beans her in the head. I mean, it's high drama. Part of the reason we know so much about what happened in Salem Village is because Samuel Parris, here we go, Samuel Parris took down all these notes. And when you read it, it doesn't sound old-fashioned or anything. It sounds like, wow, what would I have done? I've been in a couple of documentaries, and one of them was specifically designed to say, this guy's to blame for everything. He was the reason for the Salem witchcraft trials and why everybody died. And it was kind of hard for me because I don't really think that's the case. I think he was a young minister. And think about this. If the devil is attacking, he's a young minister, the devil is attacking his church. He's in Massachusetts. The devil is attacking Massachusetts. Not only is the devil attacking Massachusetts, it's attacking his town. It's not just attacking his town, it's right in his own parsonage and members of his own family. He had reason to be upset. I don't think he was just, fire and brimstone. I mean, he took this personally. This is a personal attack on him, and I don't really think that makes him the bad guy. This is the picture of the only person in Salem Village that we've got. Because every once in a while I get emails from kids, and do you have any photographs of Abigail Williams? No. And when you see things on TV, they have all sorts of illustrations, and it's usually 19th century woodcuts, imaginations of what happened. This, I decided I wanted to see it. I like seeing things in person. I've worked with all these documents. I wanted to see this, and it's down at Massachusetts Historical Society. It's this big. It's a miniature. And you can see the hinge up there, clearly it was some kind of locket. And we know what the provenance is, so we know that this is Samuel Parris. He didn't fare well at the end. People didn't want him to stay their minister, but I sometimes just look at him in the eyes and go, you know, his family was being assaulted. I don't blame him for anything he did, except he really could take down such good notes. If he'd done that for some of the others, maybe things would have changed. I don't know. So they have all this interrogation. At the end of it, the magistrates could decide whether they're going to hold the person over for proceedings or not. And only one person got out of it, because his name was Nehemiah Abbott Jr., and he was a teenager. And the girls, the accusations of why they picked different people, they would claim to see the specter of the person coming to afflict them. And only the afflicted girls could see these things. Everybody else was looking around going, oh, see, oh. And you have several girls in a row where at this point there were several teenagers who were also feeling afflicted. And they go, oh yeah, oh, look, Goody Nurse is biting her. And everybody, oh yes, she's biting me. It was, you'll hear some people use the phrase conversion disorder or something. You know. Personally, I think, just think of middle school girls. Think of one of them going, oh, there's an ant on my leg. How soon are all the girls going to feel bugs on them? Somewhere. I mean, the power of suggestion can really, especially if it's something you don't want. You know, suddenly, you know, okay, I'm going to give you 2 words. Get ready. Head lice. Doesn't your scalp just crawl just hearing those things? The suggestibility in that era. So I think it's fancy to say, oh, conversion disorder and stuff like that. But I think they also got a whole lot of reaction from the adults, and the adults believed them. So even more reason to keep accusing. Plus the adults were sort of fanning it on. They had their own agendas. So they were going to be able to accuse people by saying they saw their specter. And they just started accusing everybody, and they described them usually. You know, somebody wore a white hood, or in this case of Nehemiah Abbott Jr., they said he had a wen on his forehead. Now, how many of you play Scrabble or do crossword puzzles? A wen, W-E-N. It's a bump. So now if you do those things, you got another word, a wen. Well, when they brought him in, they brushed away his hair, and voila, his acne had cleared up. So he didn't match, his physical body did not match the specter that the girls were describing, so they let him go. After that, the girls were a little wiser. How do you know it's Goody Martin that afflicts you? Well, she said her name was Goody Martin and she came from Amesbury. Every single specter after that identified themselves. Okay. Well, they wised up, you know. And they were just accusing people left and right. They didn't even know these people. But when they came in and were examined, the magistrates, we could keep them or release them. Nehemiah Abbott was the only one who was released. What they would do is keep them, and what do you do when you keep them? Well, you have to send them to prison. Now, this is a minimus, and this is for sending Martha Corey, Rebecca Nurse, Dorothy Good, the little one, Sarah Cloyce, John Proctor, and Elizabeth Proctor, to Boston prison at the end of May. They had been kept in Salem prison, but they were going down to Boston for trial. So every time they moved from one custody to another, one jail to another, there would be a document like this. We don't have every single thing, but we have enough of them to understand. And one of the reasons a document like this is handy is if you're following somebody, if you're following your ancestor, you can sometimes see exactly which prisons they went to where and with whom. And I really like to know who was in the room when. Again, these are still the local magistrates are doing, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, and they basically went after everybody. So one of the things I like about this document, as I said, is you can tell where they went when, but if you have a jailer's bill like this one in Boston, this basically can tell you how long they were there. This one has a bill for chains for Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, cost 14 shillings. 2 blankets for Sarah Good's child, 10 shillings. Now, we know Dorothy's with her, but she also was breastfeeding at the time. So, that was pretty intense. They also paid blacksmiths for shackles for 10 prisoners. Is that one? Yeah. And then, all the rest of this is lists of the diet for all the different prisoners. And they charged by the week, and it lists all the different names and how long they were there and how much they're being charged. So you can actually keep track of who was there when and make your individual timelines for the people, the specific people that you're interested in. So bills like this are awesome. We also have bills from the blacksmiths. This is how much stuff they did, how many pairs of shackles, how many fetters, what did they repair for handcuffs and things like that. So that's the level of detail that we have in the records. I'm going to switch now and move over back up here to New Hampshire and Hampton. Exeter didn't really have a problem with witches, but Hampton did. And probably the most important one and most annoying one was Eunice Cole over in Hampton. And she was accused multiple times over the years. She was the neighbor from hell. You would not want her living next door to you. She swore, she did all of that. And then one time, she was actually trying to get the little girl in the neighborhood, come little girl, come live with me. It wasn't so much that she was a witch, she's just kind of creepy from what I can tell. But you know, it's easier to accuse somebody of witchcraft. This particular one is asking that the Court of Assistants in Massachusetts, because it's 73, we aren't in New Hampshire yet, she'd been interrogated and sent to prison in Boston. They just hadn't gotten around to trying her, because sometimes it would take a long time. You know, if somebody was accused in January, they might not have their trial until, May or June. It would take a long time, unlike in the Salem witchcraft trials where it was just bang, bang, bang. John Proctor, it was really fast. Samuel Wardwell was accused at the end of August, and by the 22nd of September, he was dead. So they did some things really fast. But in this case, this is an order to prepare the court. Not that they had to get the grand jury and they had to get the jury members to get together to try her. This is in 67. This is a quick little timeline of her lifetime. She starts showing up in the legal records in 1640 because she needed to be whipped for something or other. And then starting in 56, there she was being accused of witchcraft. 73, we got it again. And then in 1680, well, it wasn't so much she was doing anything, it's just that other people like Rachel Fuller and Isabel Toll in Hampton were being accused of witchcraft, so they just hauled her out again. Even though they knew she was a witch, but she never hanged. She was never actually convicted of anything. It's just she was the usual suspect that they pulled out. Of the ones in Hampton, I mentioned Rachel Fuller. This is a deposition against her. Now, when you're starting to put together a case against somebody, you would collect witness testimony, and they had to have it written. They had to have everything written, which is awesome, because papers come down to, I don't know what we're going to do in the next generation. How do we get those texts? You know, all these wonderful pieces of paper. So this is the deposition of Elizabeth Denham, and she's basically saying that Rachel Fuller had been overly interested in a very ill infant in the neighborhood by the name of Moses Godfrey. He was about 1 year old, and she's saying, she just kept calling, asking, what do you think is wrong with the kid, blah, blah, blah. She kept calling her own kid Moses. And so they said, let's hold her over. It's creepy behavior, but is it really witchcraft? So when they arrested her, they actually let her out on bail of 100 pounds so that she would come back and face her grand jury and her trial. Now in Salem, they didn't do any of that. Because usually when you're accused of witchcraft, if they decided they were going to prosecute, you could get out on bail. This is one of the cases they didn't do that in Salem. And finally, let's see, that was, she was tried, but they didn't convict her. And she got to go home, but usually they kept the money for a little bit to make sure that you would behave yourself. This is one of the depositions in the Salem trials. We're back in Salem. This is against John Willard, one of the men that was accused. About 25% of the people who were accused in Salem were men. He was one of the few men that wasn't like a husband of somebody who was also accused. This one is basically from Mary Walcott, who was one of the teenage girls, and he's describing that I saw the apparition of John Willard. And that was the big thing. They were saying, the apparitions were doing all this nasty stuff. And the court was taking that as actual evidence. One of the things about this, can you see that there are two different colors of ink? See that, about that line? Well, it's the same handwriting. It's the handwriting of Thomas Putnam, who was the town clerk in Salem, and his daughter, Ann Putnam Jr., who was one of the people who was claiming affliction. But we tried to figure out why does the ink change? Well, we thought, sort of like you hear hoofbeats and whinnying, you think horse before you think zebra, right? Ordinary. Maybe they ran out of ink. There's an ordinary explanation for this. Except that we were looking at all these documents in person, and the documents are in about a dozen different archives, and we suddenly just realized we've seen this ink change in 17 different depositions penned by Thomas Putnam. I don't think he ran out of ink midway through every single one of them, especially since when it starts up, also on the 18th May being the day of his examination, I was most grievously tortured by him during the time of his examination. They all start out with that, giving the date of the person being examined. Grievously tortured, all of that, but during the examination, and you try to figure out, well, what's important about that? Well, this is what's important about that. This is an actual indictment. The indictment specifies the actual crime. And you can't convict somebody unless you have specified the crime. What did they do? When did they do it? Who did they do it to? All that kind of stuff. And this is one of the indictments against Rebecca Nurse. Can you see the color change there too? Yeah. It was, one person's job was to write out the indictment with blanks. This is a fill-in-the-blank form. And if you've been to a lawyer, you know it's sort of like, okay, what's your maiden name? Okay, what's the date? And you just fill in the blank. They did it then too. It's all handwritten. And the person who filled it in was the prosecutor. It doesn't say that on this, but we were keeping track of everybody's handwriting, and we finally found a document that the prosecutor signed and went, oh, I know where his handwriting is. It's in the middle of this. So his job was to specify the exact charges. And down here at the bottom, you can see these are the 4 girls that were all making the accusations, and witnesses in every other case against them. So you would have this particular document. Now, one of the things that just, when I realized this, are you kidding me? When was the day that the act occurred? What day did they actually commit witchcraft? In almost every single one of these documents, it's the day they were examined. It wasn't for something they did 10 years ago. It wasn't for something they did in February. It wasn't for anything else. It's on the day that they were examined. So when they're in there being examined, and the girls are going crazy and saying, "Oh, there's Goody Corey up on the bar. Oh, Rebecca Nurse is biting me. Her specter is biting me." Things like that. Because there were so many witnesses, they said, "Okay, we're going to get them on that." But the witchcraft they did in front of everybody. Did they think these people were stupid? But they had witnesses, and they had a date. So the reason that other document is really important to add on to that deposition, that they were afflicted on the day of the examination, is that made that evidence support the indictment. I mean, these guys understood the law. I mean, this is what these documents tell us. There's a lot of different things that they were pulling together. In this case, this is a copy, and it tells a copy because it says, Vera copia, true copy. They would dig out old cases and find evidence against you and bring in authorized copies of that so that your past could come back to haunt you. Actually, it always did. Even though they say, no, there's redemption and forgiveness, no, once accused of witchcraft, always accused of witchcraft. They also, in this case, would summons witnesses. They would actually get people to come in and give testimony. And in this case, let's see, who's this? Susanna Martin. And in this case, there were lots of different people being called in her case. And this one, where have I got on that one? Oh, this is, one of the people was, let's see, I added this in for somebody. Oh, the Kimball Family Association. One of their ancestors came out against Susanna Martin. But they would summons all these witnesses to come in, and they had to travel to get there. Anytime they had to travel, there's a case, again in 1680 out of Newbury, where it was being tried in Boston, and everybody, it took them 5 days out of their life to go, two days to travel to Boston, a day to give testimony, and 2 days to get back, and the province had to pay them for that. So it took a lot to get all these people out there. You also have more depositions. Oh, this is the one against Susanna Martin. It just goes on and on. They just brought in anything they could think of. One of the other things they would do is they would search bodies. They would try to collect, they got testimony, they're trying to search the bodies. And what they were doing was looking for a witch's teat. This falls in line with all the stuff about having a familiar. We think of a black cat, but it could be anything. It could be a little bird, it could be a snake, it could be a turtle, you name it, a puppy, something like that. But they had to find something on the person's body that the imp was suckle from. Now, this is a painting made by Tompkins Matson in 1853. And if you see any show about Salem, they will have sections of that. They illustrate it with these. Guess what? This was painted in 1853, not 1692. He was trying to imagine what it was like. And in this case, it shows this old woman pointing out a witch's teat on the back of the young woman, and look, everybody's looking. Somebody's fainting down there. Oh, look at that. And they're the magistrates going, oh my, well, that's not how it happened. It is not. There was also there was a show with Kirstie Alley, and it was a 2-night thing. Oh my goodness. Some of these shows, nobody wants to watch them with me because I go, but they actually had Rebecca Nurse stripped naked in front of a jury of men and the ministers and the magistrates, and I'm going, okay, Shirley MacLaine's butt looks fine, there was all that dancing, but that's not how it happened. That's not how it happened. They would send men off with a doctor and a jury of men to examine the men's bodies, and they would send women off with a doctor and a jury of women to examine the women's bodies. Curiously, they almost always found something because, you know, it could be a wart, it could be a mole, it could be a pimple, it could be just some skin. I mean, these are people from the British Isles. They're gonna have something. They're gonna have something. I'm sorry. And they would search them in their secret parts. Rebecca Nurse, when she was searched, they were finding something, and she wasn't having any of that. She said, you don't have you don't have a midwife on this. A midwife's going to know what that is. And all I could think of was, well, you know, scarring, prolapsed uterus, something. But she was just mad because they didn't have anybody examining her who she knew would be able to identify it and see it, because she'd given birth to like 8 or 9 kids. So that was, but it didn't look like this. And then they'd come back and say what they found. They also would examine dead bodies. In this case, that little baby, Moses Godfrey, he died. So that's not good for Rachel Fuller. But again, they take the coroner and a jury of people to examine the body. And this was ordinary. I mean, if they found somebody dead, they didn't know what happened, they would go in and look at the bodies. If they found somebody in water, they checked to see if there's water in their lungs. Did they drown, or did somebody kill them and throw them in the water? That kind of thing. They really tried. Some of the stuff they weren't quite good at, but they discovered that, yeah, oh, is this one? Oh, sorry, I'm not at that one. This is, I'm off topic. This is the one from Rebecca Nurse. I will get to the dead bodies in a minute. Yeah, I skipped one. They would look for books of palmistry, anything that you would be doing any kind of witchcraft, and they did find some. As a matter of fact, one woman, she had one 20 years ago, and yet she gave it away because her minister told her to. And 20 years later, the minister was out there saying, oh, she used to have this thing. It's like, you can't win. You just can't win. Maybe I need to put this close. But this is little Moses Godfrey, and he died. And so there's all the people that examined the dead body, and they do think we found grounds of suspicion that the child was murdered by witchcraft. How? What were they looking at? But it didn't matter, because the court was dealing with these folks and the ones looking for witches' teats as finders of fact. Was there a witch's teat? Was there evidence of a particular method and manner of death? And those would be just taken as evidence that would then go to the court. Now, one thing they didn't do in Salem was to dunk them in the water. The whole idea on this, you probably know this, that if you sink, you're innocent, if you float, you're guilty. Some of the thinking about that is that the water being pure will accept the good people and would reject the bad people. Well, the Mathers, Cotton and Increase Mather, who were big divines in Boston, rejected this. It's sort of like, you can't just say water. Otherwise nobody could, you wouldn't be able to make this work in the real world. However, in the same summer, over in Connecticut, they ducked them. Yep, there you go. And guess what? She buoyed up like a cork. She swam upon the water. Not good, not good. In the case of the first woman, is Elizabeth Clawson. She was found not guilty, notwithstanding floating on the water test. And Mercy Desborough was found guilty, but they ended up pardoning her. So it wasn't necessarily convicted in that case. So once you have all this stuff put together and you go before the court and they actually indict you, then you go to trial. We do not have the record book for the Court of Oyer and Terminer. And these guys, if anything, were sticklers by having everything written down, and they had record books. We don't have that, but we do have the court for the Superior Court of Judicature, that thing in blue. And this is basically what it looks like. This is a very bad image. Part of that has to do with the fact that this book fell behind file cabinets in the Suffolk County Courthouse for many years. I read newspaper articles before I started done a little bit of this stuff, and I read it. It said, 17th century court book discovered behind the file cabinet in Suffolk County Courthouse. I went, Court of Oyer and Terminer, Court of Oyer and Terminer. No, it turned out to be this one that we already knew about, but it had just fallen away. And this is from a microfilm that was shot, and they don't let you near it. I'm sure I can go down and ask Elizabeth Bouvier with some reason why I have to see it, but oh, I'm sure she has that deep, deep in the vaults. I mean, somebody let it slip behind the file cabinet. But basically, what the record book tells you is who the justices were on the bench, who was on the grand jury, who was on the jury of trials, and then it repeats the text of the indictment and tells the verdict. And if you're found not guilty, you are released upon paying your jailer's fees. If you were found guilty, then you were sentenced. And since this is a capital case, the sentence would be death. It doesn't really matter that we don't have the record book from the Court of Oyer and Terminer. Most of the stuff that's important is all those depositions and all those things, but boy, wouldn't it be nice to have it. I think it probably 20 years later when they were making amends for all of this, I bet that book got used within an inch of its life. It probably just didn't survive because people went back and got amends. Not everybody was convicted. Our good friend Eunice Cole, she wasn't convicted, but she wasn't legally guilty according to the indictment. They were being, but just grounds of vehement suspicion of having had familiarity with the devil. You didn't even have to get convicted, and they would put you on house arrest and stuff like that because they're trying to keep the peace. But if they were going to execute you, they had to have a warrant for your execution. This is the warrant for Bridget Bishop. The little red dot on the side is a wax seal. The only things we found wax seals on were for summonses for witnesses and for death warrants, because those were actually demands by the court. She was indicted on June 2nd, convicted on June 2nd, both grand jury and trial jury, and executed on June 10th. Yeah. On the same day, on the same weekend, the same day on June 3rd, Rebecca Nurse and John Willard were also indicted, but they didn't try them for much later. So we're trying to figure out why different people were brought up first. One of the reasons I think that Bridget Bishop was first is that years before she had been accused of witchcraft before. And they were going to try her in a superior court, and they never got around to it. Here she is again. We're going to get her. She was an easy case. She'd already been accused before. They had all this information, and they went after her first. Now, I said at one point I didn't think Samuel Parris was the bad guy in all this. This is the guy. This is the guy. This is William Stoughton. He's the one that signed all those death warrants. He's the one that ran the court. You see, there's a building in the background. That's Stoughton Hall. It was a dormitory he gave to Harvard. That was his alma mater. It cost £1,000. to have that. It was for about 40 students. He had a long career. He was trained for the ministry. He was a minister for a while. He was a selectman. He got out of ministry, became a selectman, and went into being a magistrate. He was a politician. He did all sorts of things in his life. But if you look anywhere, they'll always say he was the chief magistrate of the Salem witchcraft trials. Doesn't matter what other good deeds or acts he ever did, you'll always see this taint on him. I've always said he's the bad guy, but now I've decided I'm writing a biography of him. And you know, anytime you start seeing somebody a little more on a personal level, you get a little more, yeah, I'm starting to kind of like him. And I'm trying to figure out why he did what he did. So it'll take a while. Nobody has written a biography of him. He didn't get married, he didn't have any kids. He didn't leave a diary. I haven't found many personal letters from him, although he was clearly very literate. I've found all sorts of formal letters. So he's really this big mystery. And I'm on a task to figure out more about him and see if we can figure out more about why he was such a hard nose on these. He wasn't letting people out on bail. Usually you get, like Rachel Fuller, you get out. But it wasn't until October that they actually started releasing people from jail. This is a recognizance for 3 kids, Stephen Johnson, Abigail Johnson, and Sarah Carrier from Andover. They were 13, 10, and 8. Now, Rachel Fuller is 100 pounds to get her out. No, it was like the people in Andover said, okay, how much to get these kids out? It's October, it's getting cold. And the court said, no, we don't have to live. No, come on, what'll it take? 500 pounds each. Now, that would be, you have to put up something. So basically, the wealthiest man in Andover and the fathers of these kids put up bond for the kids. And if you put up bond, you were responsible for the kids. So that's why they had the fathers. But this guy, with the fathers of all these kids, actually bailed out 8 children at 500 pounds apiece. And those were the first people that were let out. And they were just little kids. I mean, an 8-year-old girl in jail? Because I said, they all confessed. They were all coerced into confessing, especially in Andover. So it took a while, and they started letting people out, and they finally got back to normal, but it took a while. After everything was over, and they finally had either convicted or released everybody, there was a general assessment that something had gone wrong, that they had done something wrong. And this is one of the other judges, Samuel Sewell, probably better known than Stoughton will ever be, because he had this incredible journal that's left behind. He had all sorts of family members, and he liked writing about, you know, drinking chocolate with William Stoughton, and just all these different things. He's a very vivid, it's a textured picture we have of him. But he also, one day, in 1696, he went to church and handed a note to his minister in Boston and said, would you please read this? And he stood there with his head hung down. And basically, did I get this one? Oops, sorry. Basically, he apologized. He said, I desire to take the blame and the shame of it. And that's the only real apology we get. We don't get one from Stoughton at all. But there are whole books written about Sewell's apology. And we know so much about him, but we still don't know about Stoughton. One of the other things that happened, you know, we knew everything had gone wrong and people were apologizing. They said, well, but they still had those convictions on the books. And it was basically called attainder, your tainting of the blood. Once you have been sentenced, you are dead in the eyes of the law. You have no civil rights anymore. So as we get into about 10 years after the fact, you start seeing people appealing to Massachusetts to reverse the attainder on their names, because they stand convicted of witchcraft, a capital crime. So they just start going. And it took about another 10 years before they turned those over. They also said that they would do reparations. So usually it was just a little bit of, you know, it cost me this much to get a copy of my husband's case. But in some cases, they actually took all their stuff. I'm going to cough just a second. If you were convicted and sentenced, they could come in and take all your stuff. Just your movable goods, your goods and chattels. That means the contents of your house, your barn, your farm, everything, not the land. This is something from the Wardwell family saying, you took 36 pounds worth of our stuff, and then how much it's all worth. So that's a nice list, but this is my fun slide. 5 cows, a heifer and a yearling, a horse, and 9 hogs. This is what they took. They took that much livestock. That makes a farm. A farm with that much livestock, they can do well. But because he was convicted, they could take it all. If you ran away, when they went to go get you, they could also take your stuff. So we see some of these bills for a lot of property. So in addition to the livestock, they took hay. They took his carpentry tools. This is one of those Eric Sloan pictures. Hand tools for carpentry basically haven't changed a whole lot over the centuries. They didn't have those power tools. They took the corn in the field. So you know exactly what time of year it was. They took all that, and it was 36 pounds. They wanted to be compensated for that. Well, they were compensating everybody, and they were asking people what they lost. And I know that I can sometimes have a lot of fun with some of the details, and it's just some of it's absurd. But they asked William Good, well, what did you lose? And he said, my wife, Sarah Good, was imprisoned above 4 months and executed. A sucking child died in prison before the mother's execution. A child of 4 or 5 years old was in prison 7 or 8 months, and being very hardly used, was chained in the dungeon and terrified that she has ever since been very chargeable with little or no reason to govern herself. And so he said, I leave it to the honored court to decide what I've lost with my family being destroyed. You can't compensate somebody for that. He said, how about 30 pounds? So they gave him that. There's a lot of stuff, when you go to Salem in October, there's a lot of fun and games. And people like that, that's okay. But I'm always come back to this, at the very end, no matter how absurd some of it is, how clever some stuff is, or how interesting it is to do the details. In the end, lives were lost, families were decimated, and I don't know if we've necessarily always learned from our mistakes. I'd like to think we have, but each generation something comes around. And if anything, we can't learn to predict crazy. And that's one thing we know about crazy. I mean, who would know that we had to take our shoes off to go on the airplane? It was one crazy guy with ominous sneakers. Now we all have to take off our shoes. But you can't predict that, You just can't. You can't predict crazy. You can't predict insane and evil. So you can't really learn how to prevent against that, because some of these things that people do, the reason it's so evil and crazy is it's just inconceivable. What we can learn, however, is how to respond when we recognize that something's going wrong. And the lesson to me comes from Andover, because it was Andover. The wealthiest man went with the fathers. He went forward and they got those kids out. They got everything changed. They gathered as a group. They were the ones that were going after reversing attainder. They were placing the children of a Wardwell family. They had 6 kids. I mean, all that stuff, their whole farm was taken. What do you do with 6 kids who are, teenagers and younger? So the selectmen are getting together. They were figuring out through one of the lower courts, can we place them with other families to take care of them and things like that. Andover came together and said, look, we're going to fix this. And if we're going to look for examples of how to get past horrible things, I think the lesson is we have to come together and realize what's important. And this is why North Andover likes me to come and talk to them. They feel like, oh, hey, we're good. But I think there's something to be learned from that. That, you know, horrible things always happen. But how do we get past them, and how do we come together? And that is coming together, even though we have differences. So I thank you very much. And I am happy to take questions. Oh, I'm eager for that. Okay, first.
I'm just curious about that richest man in Andover. You know, do we know who he was and why he had so much money?
This particular, he probably had a lot of land. Land was, you know, if you had land, you were rich. So, yes?
Since this all happened in a fairly compressed period of time, has anybody ever figured out what caused this hysteria? Was it fear of Indian raids, or what brought all this on?
Okay, the question is, because it took place in a very compressed period of time, we figured out what has caused this, and he asked if it was the Indian raids. Well, because there were a lot of things happening on the frontier, and a lot of the people who were involved had some connection to the frontier, there is a lot of speculation that, yes, that kind of fear was part of the mix. Also, that the judges, including Stoughton and all these people who are running things, they were also in charge of the militia on the frontier, and they weren't really doing very well in the visible world fighting the Indians, but they, by gum, they were going to get it in the invisible world, and they were going to get the riches. So if you really like this as a particular topic and the role of Maine and the frontier, Marybeth Norton's book, In the Devil's Snare, has a lot of details about that, and a lot of King William's War, which was going on right then. Question? Yeah.
How many of the ones that were executed actually confessed?
How many of the people who were actually executed confessed? One. It was Samuel Wardlow. Now, I have a controversial stance on confessions. This is why I don't think they wanted me on their show. Quite often you'll hear that if you confessed, you saved your life. And that's why so many people confess. And frankly, no. One of the things that does, if you believe that, it means that everybody had a chance to save their lives. If you just confessed, you wouldn't hang. And look at all these people that hanged. Well, they must have felt that they had to speak the truth. They weren't going to lie, even if it was down to their life. And what does that do to somebody? It makes them a martyr. They had a choice, and they held to the truth. I don't believe that they were going to spare anybody who confessed. I think Stoughton was ready to hang them. Because if you look at the people he was going to send to the gallows in January, that included confessors. There were people who confessed and pled guilty. Oh, Rebecca Ames, anyone? Yeah, she confessed, she pled guilty, and they gave him a little more time. It wasn't like the June 2 to June 10 execution for Bridget Bishop. They let her hang around a little bit to make her peace with God. There was a little bit of that. And then in January, she was going to hang. The fact that they didn't hang many of those confessors is just coincidental. A lot of people like to look back and say, oh, they didn't hang the confessors, therefore they weren't going to hang them. And people knew that if they confessed, they wouldn't hang. And I don't believe that. I really don't believe that. If you are here in New Hampshire, strangely enough, we still have the death penalty. And if you kill an officer, a police officer, the penalty is the death penalty. Whether you agree with it or not, this is just what it is right now. And I swear, with the right amount of time and the right interrogators, any of you in this room could be convinced to confessing to killing a police officer. You could. And you probably say, no way, I wasn't even in the room. Oh, well, where were you? There are tactics that police use. If they think you did it, there are ways to elicit a confession. The Reed method is used by police officers all over the place. And when the police think you did it, they will do everything to get you confessed because that's the gold standard, then and now. And if you don't believe that the police are able to coerce a confession out of you. Oh man, how about those, was it Central Park 5? Those are teenagers. A whole lot of the people who confessed in Andover, guess what? 8-year-old Sarah Carrier, teenagers. One of the people who confessed was Tituba. Okay, here she is, a slave. She had zero agency in her life. Think that would be an easy one to coerce a confession out of? Yeah, I love it. I heard something recently say, we don't know why Tituba confessed. And I'm going, yes, we do. Yes, we do. So they could do this because that would get, they were trying to get confessions so that they could convict them and execute them. It just happened that they were holding off on executing a few people. It was just coincidence that we didn't have many. The one person who confessed and was executed, that was the one, Samuel Wardwell. That was like a matter of 3.5 weeks. And when they interrogated him and said, okay, you know, are you a witch, all those things, and finally he said, oh, sure. Finally, because it would make him stop. That's a typical thing in coerced confessions. Finally, they just wear you down and say, fine, okay, I did it. One of the protections for people when you're being accused of things is they always would come back to you and say, okay, we have this account of your confession. You know, now, that happened a couple weeks ago. Now, is this true? Sign it. I mean, you're basically signing your own death warrant by saying, yeah, this is true. And he said, I said those words, but they weren't true. Now, they indicted him on that charge, and they executed him on that charge. So I really think that they were planning to execute all those people, and they were gleeful that they had actually gotten confessions because you didn't need anything else from there. And to this day, if you heard that somebody confessed to a crime, even if later on it's proven it was coerced, don't you really sort of go, well, you know, why would he have said something against his own self-interest? Because you're basically coerced to do something. So I think they didn't really have a choice about living and dying. And so if you listen to the Smithsonian thing, they really talk about us Christian martyrs. And I don't think so. And I think it's because they were so good at coercing confessions. And that's also an issue we still have today, the coercion of false confessions. And we have to watch out for it. You know, what are we really looking for? We want somebody to blame. So that's where I am on those. I hope you get a chance to listen to the Smithsonian one or watch the Smithsonian one, because they're talking about what they did to determine where the people were actually hanged. It's fabulous work. These are all my buddies. But I can tell when I was watching it, I go, no, they didn't want me on there. Because I think something different. So anyway, yes?
In terms of charging women, I've always read that there were women who were herbalists who would get charged. Is that a myth or?
Okay, the question is, she's always heard that women who are herbalists and healing women and cutting folk and stuff like that. In this case, in the cases here in Salem, not so much. Not so much. I mean, Rebecca Nurse, hey, was she a nurse? No. She had a lot of kids, but it wasn't uncommon. In 1681 in Boston, a woman named Mary Hale was accused of witchcraft, and part of it was that she was somebody that was a midwife and would help take care of people. But the case against her sort of went nowhere when the young man she supposedly had been bewitching, they got evidence that he had fallen from the topsail in a ship about a week or so earlier, and when the surgeon opened him up for the autopsy, his spleen and his liver and his kidneys were all damaged, so she didn't bewitch him, he fell. And they had evidence they'd done that, but she was looked at because, you know, he was sick, he was a boarder at her place, you know, she was good at healing. So it sometimes happened because at a certain point, a certain percentage of women were doing a lot of healing. And a certain percentage of women are going to be midwives and things like that. So some of them are going to get accused, but not overwhelmingly. Yep.
Was there anything in your research that said that anybody who was accused said, if I could do this, don't you think I'd do it to you right now?
Yeah. Were there any, the question is, were there any people who said, well, you know, if you think I can do this, why am I not doing this to you? Well, there were people who were speaking out against what was going on, and one of them was a man named Thomas Brattle. and he wrote a letter. Now, you couldn't publish things with the printing press. I think you have a lovely printing press here. It's a big deal to have a printing press, but the government controlled whether you could print things or not. But quite often they would have handwritten copies. They have a really good letter or something, people would just make multiple copies of it and circulate it that way. They didn't have to deal with the rules about printing presses. And one of the things that he brings up lots of things. He's the one that we learned about the effluvia and stuff like that, which he thinks is absolutely cockamamie. One of the things he said, don't you think that maybe when they're being interrogated, that why aren't they afflicting the judges? Why aren't they looking at the judges and making them, have these things? And he brings that out, but it's not necessarily some of the women. There was also another magistrate, Robert Pike, who said, you'd think that they would be smart enough not to perform this stuff in front of everybody. So right, like we said before. And so there were voices of reason who were well known to all the judges and people, but it took a while before people actually went, oh, they were right.
But in the records of the hearings or the interrogations, nobody ever said something like that would
I don't think
to defend themselves.
Off the top of my head, I don't think so.
Wow.
Why aren't I afflicting you? There may have been one or two, but it wasn't a big deal. But it was mostly these other people bringing up the whole circumstance. So, yeah, you would think. I mean, sure, I'm going to do this in front of everybody. I don't want them to know I'm a witch, but I'm going to do it anyway. Yes?
Within the last year or two, supposedly have found where the witches were hanged in Salem.
Yes, that's what the Smithsonian thing is.
Just a myth that the guy is trying to sell a book.
Interesting, because I know all of them. I know all of them. Okay, the basic story, they was talking about where they found where the hangings were. Frankly, any of us who do Salem already knew it. There's a ledge down on near the base of Gallows Hill, and everybody assumes with the name Gallows Hill, that's hanging way up there, except that you don't get quite the sight lines for the top. There's something at the bottom called Proctor's Ledge, and it really was a place that people could be down the bottom and see what was going on. And we've sort of known this, most of us, but I also think it's very interesting, how do we know what we know? And my friends Tad Baker, Ben Ray from Virginia, Marilyn Roach, and Dick Trask they're fabulous. They decided they were going to sit down and say, okay, we're going to show people how we know that's where it was, on Proctor's Ridge. And they got somebody with ground penetrating radar. They did all these things. They looked at primary sources. They looked at, they made visualizations using 3D mapping and things like that for looking at sight lines. They used ground penetrating radar to see if they could find places in the ledge where the descriptions matched. And sure enough, it all matches. And what they did with that, though, was that the area is already owned by Salem, the city of Salem, and it was just trashed. So what they were able to do was to get the city of Salem to take care of that little piece of property, clean it up, give it the honor that it has, and they managed to get an extra memorial right there. It's right next to a Walgreens parking lot. But, I'd gone there before. I already knew about this place. But what they did was they actually got Salem to own this to admit they own this property, to take care of it, and make another memorial. They also wanted to do a documentary. And sure enough, they got a company production company in Maine, Lone Wolf Productions. Julie Moffat, what's her last name? Her son is part of it, and they started filming these things, but it wouldn't fill up a whole hour for a documentary. So they shopped it around, and finally they got the Smithsonian Channel to put it into their series on secret histories. And then, okay, they didn't have enough to make a whole hour, so they padded it. They brought in two best-selling authors who've written about witches, Catherine Howe and Stacy Schiff, to have them do some extra talking. And then they did what every single documentary on Salem has. They got reenactors of girls to scream. Pointing. They get another reenactor to be a very passionate minister, either rehearsing his sermons in the house and scaring the kids, or they get them on the pulpit. And then they get reenactors to be judges, and all they do is, they don't say anything, they just look stern. And inevitably, there are the dirty-faced accused being hauled by oxen in a cart, and then they have pictures of the noose sort of going like this, and next thing you know, you got bare feet just sort of dangling there. And that's in every single one of these documentaries, and they put it in this one. It's sort of like, how can I tell that from the History Channel's one, or, oh, the BBC one? It just, they do that. But I think if you look just at the stuff about how they determined specifically, using the kind of evidence they did to determine the place they were hanged, it's very interesting, because I'm always interested in how do we know what we know. And what they wanted to do was to show the public how we as historians know that was the place, not the top of Gallows Hill. And if they get a good book out of it, good. This is something that a lot of people have heard about. How many people have heard about this? The girls ate some kind of nasty rye bread or moldy bread, and they were hallucinating and tripping, and that's what caused the... Is that what you've heard? Yeah. Okay. This is something that's a very commonly known story. And getting back to the stuff on how do we know what we know, I have given a whole talk about this whole theory, and you can get it. If you want to hear the details, I can just give you the thumbnail of it. But if you want to know all about it, Google me, Margo Burns and ergot.